had fine talons right down her back. Well, as I told you, my mother did take care of him later in her own way. And my mother, remember, was a good Christian those days. She did not have suspicion. She did not hold suspicions in her heart, but she became convinced that I would be born with chicken feet. As I said, she did not have suspicion, but she did not tell anyone this. Certainly not me until years later, and not even her husband, my father, did she tell at the time. Well, at my birth, we were all taken to the mothers in those days in receiving gowns, and the young man who was born at the same time I was Albert Munson, a healthy Swede. He was huge at birth. I was very small, Scottish Welsh, about this big. My receiving blanket and his were mixed up by the nurse, of course, who was overcome by two births so close together. That didn't happen in Georgetown. Certainly many people didn't even go to the hospital. Much safer in those days. They switched the receiving gowns. Naturally, Munson with mine on was quite restricted. Good, healthy Swedish family. I, on the other hand, was smothered. Up to my eyeballs, and my feet and hands and everything was covered up, and I was brought in and presented to my mother, and as the story goes, she was worried about the chicken feet. And she asked Dr. John Martin about that. Now, John Martin was a very good doctor. He would even, come to your home in those days, an unheard of thing now, of course. He also had a disturbing sense of humor, disturbing to everybody else. He didn't know the story about the chicken feet. My mother began asking about, is John okay? The eyes, the fingers. And she got down to the feet, and Dr. John could not hesitate. He lifted up the cloth, and he said, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1. My mother, of course, thought he was counting talons. He knew when to stop. She almost screamed. Dr. John said, "What's wrong?" And by that time, the nurse, who well knew Dr. John's sense of humor, came in, took over, got him out of the room, and my mother was assured that I was whole and wonderful at that point. And this was a story that she told no one for many years, except presumably Dr. John, only to have him swear to secrecy because of her reaction. Now, this Dr. John is also responsible for seeing me in a very interesting time in my life. A little bit later, when I was capable of crawling around on outside quilts and things, in those days you could actually put a small child outside on a quilt and let him crawl around. The sunlight was not poisonous in those days. This is fun to do. And so my mother had me out on the quilt, and of course my father always had a couple of dogs and on the country place there, and Brunhilde was out in the front yard there with a litter of puppies, small litter of puppies. That's always useful, country place. Brunhilde was out there with about three pups, and Brunhilde, by the way, named by my father. He was quite aware that Brunhilde did not go around having puppies in Germanic lore, but nevertheless, he named her Brunhilde. And well, of course, I was on the blanket next to Brunhilde, and for some reason my mother had stepped in to get something out of the house. Again, that's a very safe thing to do. You're ahead of me, aren't you? You know what's going to happen here. Anyway, Brunhilde had plenty of room over there, and it probably smelled good, so I crawled on over, and Brunhilde lifted up her leg, and I crawled right in there with the other three puppies. Plenty of room for me, at that time. Only three puppies. And about that time, Dr. John Martin drove up into the driveway. He'd been out on another call, stopping by to see how my mother was and things like that. Doctors did that in those days. He walked through the front yard. He looked at, and he picked me up just about the time my mother came out of the front door. Since all people were learned in those days, he said, "Well, here you, Jervis." And she said, "Oh, my dear." And he said, "That's not going to hurt him a bit." And he says, "But, You going to change his middle name to Romulus or Remus? Here. Of course, now I can only use a line like that in front of a good audience like this, because by this time, 3/4 of the people of the world did not know who Romulus or Remus even were. But doctors in those days did. My mother and father did. And I lived through it. My mother did tell that story around town for a while, because she always said, better milk than I had, probably. I thank you for the story. Do you want to take over for another one here? We'll trade off a